Okay, so that you might get a thing that says, "Can you please accept it?" Okay, so Dave, thank you very much for agreeing to have a chat with me about this.
You're welcome, Christian.
The title of the MD that I'm doing is "How does the interplay between social and mainstream media impact upon global public health communication during a pandemic?" This is an MD that was started during the first lockdown in the UK of March 2020 and continued contemporaneously. These are some practice interviews among friends and family that I've been advised to do. But then what I have found is that they've been so rich and so useful that I will probably, or definitely if I use them, be seeking retrospective ethics to use them as part of the study. But everything would be 100% anonymized and nobody would ever say that you've said X, Y, or Z. Are you happy with that?
That's fine. Just tell me the name or the purpose of the study again. That was quite quick.
Yeah, of course. Sorry. So it's how does the interplay between social and mainstream media impact upon global public health communication during a pandemic?
Okay. Can I ask you a question first?
Of course, please. Yeah.
So when you say social media,
yeah,
do you mean what do you mean by social media?
So it's different for everybody in terms of whether it be Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, online, anything in terms of. Okay. So there's two. It's a good question, and I'm glad you said it, because one of the things in the dissertation in terms of the glossary of terms is I've got some. Hold on, let me just go to it. So there's new media and traditional media. So the definition of new media is the advent and then widespread adoption of internet is very much seen as the transition point between new media and traditional media. New media can be considered to include electronic video games and entertainment, as well as the internet and the plethora of social media channels now available.
Okay.
Whereas traditional media can be assumed to mean all communication means that existed prior to the internet. That includes printed materials, etc., etc., etc.
Okay, so I'm just going to tell you something in case it influences whether you actually want to spend time interviewing me or not. Okay, yeah. So I'm not on Facebook.
Yeah.
I don't use Twitter.
Yeah.
So the only forms of news and communication I would get with regards to COVID would be mainstream television channels.
Yeah.
And Sky News and BBC News on my iPad.
Yeah.
I also look at YouTube, but
yeah.
I haven't. Although there's things on YouTube about COVID, like news clips, I've never clicked on any of them and looked at any of them there. So all my answers will be probably within the domain of mainstream news communication.
Okay, no, that's fine. Thank you. It will be one of the things that I need to make sure that we do with this is we get a broad spread across. I don't want to just talk to people that are my age, my demographic, consume media in the same way that I do, because it's not going to be particularly helpful for any future public health responses and potential pandemics. And also, it'd be remiss for me to say thank you in terms of watching Sky. I really appreciate it, obviously, because I've got a foot in that camp. So thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Although I don't have Twitter and Facebook, you will notice I do have a webcam.
Yes, so very nice.
I'm there. Anyway.
Yes, it started. So, okay, so here we go. So 2020 has been a year. I'm just going to start a clock so I know how long we go. But 2020 has been a year like no other. The purpose of this semi-structured interview is to explore your views on the role various forms of media has had on you personally and how it's helped you process and react to evolving news of the pandemic. So the first question and the first subject is around recollections. And what are your recollections of when you first heard about COVID-19?
My first recollections were in December when on the mainstream news BBC News was the outbreak of a new virus in China, and that the city of Wuhan had been isolated because they were worried about the scale of the problem.
Yeah. And sorry, I cut you off. We going to say something else?
Yep. So obviously there was some alarm, and the initial concerns were that it was actually being underreported by the Chinese government, and this was verified to some extent by satellite images, which showed, the fact that the city had been cut off, there was a lack of main street traffic, and that the car parks in the hospitals were overwhelmed.
Remember that, and I'd forgotten about that. The car parks and yes. Okay, thank you. That's really good. Okay, and so the 1A is what source of media do you use to get your news, which we've talked about, and we get that. That's fine.
Yep.
1B is what was the first country you heard about that was affected by COVID-19, which you've talked about. So 1C is how did that news make you feel?
I felt worried because there was obviously a very serious situation within that city, which had caused an entire population group to be locked down, and there was a curfew, and people couldn't leave their houses and were being arrested. It also worried me that it was being underreported for political reasons in China, so we didn't really fully understand the scale of the problem, the seriousness of the disease, or the rate of transmission of infection.
Okay. And then when you heard it hit Italy, what was your thought processes then?
That this was a highly infective disease which had high rates of mortality, because it became very quickly clear that the hospitals in the particular towns and cities that were affected in northern Italy were overwhelmed, and large groups of people, especially within the elderly cohorts, were dying quite rapidly from this disease.
And okay, thank you. And so 1D is, did you change any behaviors on hearing the news, either in China or in Italy?
I didn't change any of my behaviors here. What it did lead me to do was watch the news and this particular health issue much more closely, because it immediately grabbed my attention as something very, very serious. I also felt that my level of concern was out of step with our government's response, which seemed to be slightly complacent to me. Their attitude, it appeared to me, was this is something in northern Italy. Well, from my point of view, if something can rapidly go from China mainland to northern Italy, it's only a stone's throw away from us, given the level of travel which occurs between European destinations. Having myself only recently been on holiday in northern Italy.
Oh, around the time you'd recently been in northern Italy? Or?
We went last summer.
Okay. Okay, thank you. That's a very articulate answer and very useful, so thanks for that. 1E is, how did your views vary as compared with your friends and family?
I think because I'd got some medical background, I think I was probably more alarmed than my friends and family who aren't from a medical background. Because as a GP, you see lots of conditions, chronic diseases, even acute infections like pneumonia, but it's very rare, even in a general practice, in an area of high social deprivation, that something leads to a patient death. So to see in northern Italy large cohorts of people dying was very alarming. And I wondered whether we were really actually prepared for this particular disease.
So it's interesting you say this particular disease, because a lot of the government communications were around, we are prepared, we've got a pandemic plan, but that was all modelled and planned and done around a flu pandemic rather than a coronavirus SARS type thing. Did you look at it in that level of depth and concern when, in terms of hearing the news saying, yeah, we're prepared, but you said that you think that the level of concern that you had was out of step with the response that the government was having? At that time, were you thinking about this is different to flu, or this is like SARS, or was there any of your biomedical training coming into play there at that point?
I think so. I mean, I couldn't say which specific aspect, but when the government said they were prepared, I 100% did not believe them. I thought it was a confidence trick for political purposes, because knowing the tools that are available in modern medicine, I didn't see how the government could protect people from such a disease once it had entered into the population, because we didn't have a vaccination for that specific illness. And what I'd seen on the media about the health system in northern Italy, they actually had a higher rate of intensive care beds per population than we had in this country. So I felt they were potentially more prepared than we were. So I couldn't see what the government was talking about when they said they were prepared.
Okay, thank you. And no, I completely agree. In terms of Lombardy, if you look at how the media portrayed it, it was as if it was like some kind of third-rate, third-world health system. Whereas,
absolutely,
if you look at the OECD rankings, they're number 2 in the world, and we were number 8 or 9 in the world.
Absolutely.
So, okay, thank you. That's very good. We're on. Okay, so that's friends and family. Okay, so number 2 is origins of COVID-19, 2A. What is your awareness on theories as to how COVID-19 came into existence?
So I think at the outset, when it originated from Wuhan, there were 2 theories. One was a theory that it developed from a wet market with possible transmission from bats or animals which had been slaughtered in that environment.
Yeah.
The second theory was that it had been a man-made virus which had been developed in a lab, either accidentally as a part of experimentation or for biochemical purposes.
Yeah. And okay, so what would you deem as a trusted source as to get information on the origins of this specifically? Is it the same news sources you'd use otherwise, or would you look at something different?
I would tend to trust the BBC, because having watched the BBC most of my life, and I'm just turned 54 now, I can't think of many occasions when the BBC has knowingly misled people or given them information which wasn't evidence-based.
Okay, thank you. And did you see any of those kind of reports in terms of the 2 theories that you've spoken about? Are there any media reports on the BBC that you remember, or programs or radios or shows or whatever? Is there any specific reference points that you think, hold on a minute, the light bulb moments?
I saw something on one of a news piece. I can't exactly remember. It was the BBC, but it was on television, so it was probably the BBC, of an interview with a virologist who had worked in the experimental center in Wuhan, and that particular person verified that they had been experimenting with this type of virus, and they felt it was entirely reasonable that this particular variant of the COVID vaccine, COVID virus,
Yeah.
could have originated in that particular lab.
Okay. And when
that was a scientist who had defected to the United States of America from China.
And when was that interview? Do you remember it? Like roughly?
I think it was in January or February.
Okay, so I haven't heard about that, so I'll dig that out and have a look at it, because that sounds quite interesting. So thank you for that. Does 2C, does detailed knowledge of the science behind COVID-19 help, hinder, or have no effect on your day-to-day response?
The detailed science in terms of the structure and the pathophysiology of the virus doesn't make any difference to me. What makes a difference to me is the same information that a lay person would have with regards to infection rates and mortality rates. So I don't need to be, the things which have alarmed me the most are the same things which a lay person could have heard and understood.
Okay. That's very interesting in terms of, and the reason I asked that is because at the beginning of this, we got told follow the science. And the reason I'm asking this is because both medical and non-medical people will be participating in this MD. Lots of people just, it's almost as if follow the science and that's it. Okay, yeah, fine, we're following the science. It's like a blind thing. It's the science. So it's not going to be questioned anymore. But then when you look at the scientific method, which is you test, you question, you share your data, you try and get it reproduced by other people in the same or similar conditions, there was a big dichotomy for me between those two things. And that's why I'm kind of seeking to explore that, to see whether that resonates with other medics and non-medics, really.
I think the mantra of follow the science was something that was used by government spokespeople to gain credibility with our population. They justified everything they did on the basis that they said they were following the science. First thing I would say about that is that they didn't follow the science. They gave the perception that they were following the science when it suited them. The second thing is, I think they used that mantra to make bad decisions that suited them economically. So say, for instance, the virus in northern Italy had a high rates of morbidity and mortality. Now, at that particular time, because there were no scientific studies which could verify that, the government chose to ignore what was common sense and what was apparent, because they're saying, well, we haven't got the evidence to tell us that we need to have a lockdown or we need to close our borders. So I think they use the mantra sometimes also to defy common sense, because there were no scientific studies available at that particular time.
Yeah, and that's interesting in terms of, I remember Matt Hancock saying something about how our data on test and trace says that it's not transmitted in the workforce. Go back to the office. And I looked at that and I think, well, hold on a minute. Is the air conditioning on? Are we turning the air conditioning off, or are we not?
Yeah.
And I spoke to the security guard at work, and he's ex-forces, and he's a great guy. And he goes, "Look, COVID secure is meaningless, Kish. It's COVID compliant, because we're not going to build this. And the point, the virus is not going to walk up to the door, look at it, and say, 'Oh, there's a COVID secure sign,' and then go away." So I thought it was a little bit disingenuous for Hancock to stand up and say, "Our test and trace is saying that most of this transmission is occurring in these little places," where we know as doctors, if you look at it, that it would be anywhere. It doesn't matter in terms of it's not workplace or home or whatever. So it's really interesting that you said that, and thank you, because that hasn't come out in any of the interviews so far.
The other thing about science, as you know, Kish, is that the reason why science is trusted by so many people is because it has a transparency, which allows anybody to look at somebody's study and the methods used. When somebody like Matt Hancock makes a statement and says, "Our studies tell us this," but that data is not available to anybody else for scrutiny, and it might be one small study involving 15 people in one office. That's not science. So he's describing that he's using science, but he's actually not, because he's not allowing the scientific community to scrutinize with the information he's saying he's using.
And I remember this as well, where now you've mentioned about it, another one of the early things that I did with this was, do you remember when they said the modeling is catastrophic, but we can't release the numbers of people that could die with this?
I don't remember that specifically.
So I actually found a doctor that did the modeling himself, and I interviewed him. His name is Michael Brooks, and we did a little 2.5 hour live stream, I think, where it was to both public and professionals. And at the end, we put enough appropriate warning throughout that broadcast saying that at the end, you might want to turn off now, because we're going to talk about what we think these numbers mean, and we want to hear what you think and talk to us. And I say we think, I mean, I didn't work out the numbers. I didn't know how to do it. He did. He was the brain behind that. But his calculations were not a million miles off, because he used the data sources that were publicly available. And then he has a coding and a computer and an NHS IT background, as well as being a doctor. And he worked it out. And then you see that they didn't release the models because, I don't know, Professor, is it Neil Ferguson? Or somebody, Ferguson, he was responsible for a gross overestimate for swine flu regarding in the slaughtering of lots of animals. His modelling was done on an Excel spreadsheet, which wasn't even done for multi-core threaded computers. Now, I don't know what that means, but people that do know what it means tell me that it's the equivalent of using a MacBook Air to do some calculations where you should really have a supercomputer. And they wouldn't release any of that data either. They wanted to lock down people on. They wouldn't. Sage was a very closed shop. So what this kind of brings it on to Sage, really. And to what degree did you hold the advice from Sage, the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies? Did you see that as helpful? Did you look at it? I mean, some of it's not even been published, so you wouldn't been able to, but the bits that did come out from Sage, what were your thoughts on that?
I think the scientists and the medics who work on Sage are obviously very intelligent, very well qualified people. But ultimately, the decisions that come out of Sage are political decisions rather than purely on the advice of the scientists. So I always felt that the advice coming out of Sage was being filtered by the small group of people at the top of the Conservative Party.
Okay, interesting. That's very good, thank you. And then has your understanding of COVID-19 increased or decreased over the past 9 to 12 months?
Well, it's obviously increased 100% over the last 12 months, because I think before the outbreak in Wuhan, if somebody had said to me COVID-19, I wouldn't have even known it was the type of virus.
Okay. Thank you. And then 2E is, this has been widely described as in the media as a once in a century event. In your view, could an outbreak such as this happen again in our lifetimes?
Absolutely.
Okay. Number 3 is section 3 is subsequent pandemic behaviours. 3A, 3-word slogans have been a big part of the UK government communications. Are there any that particularly resonate with you, and why?
No.
Okay. And why not? Why did none of them really resonate with you?
Because they are too simplistic. And I think in my own mind, I knew how to behave safely to avoid myself becoming infected or anybody else becoming infected as a result of the hygiene methods I use on a day-to-day basis in work, or that you would understand in a hospital. So they weren't my guiding principles.
Okay.
I suppose my guiding principles were a bit broader than that.
Brilliant. No, thank you. That's good. The vastly varying way COVID-19 affects people has meant shielding and asymptomatic transmission have been vital. And they've also been terms that are bandied around a lot. But what do these terms mean to you?
So if I say shielding, so shielding is a term used in relation to high-risk individuals who might have chronic diseases like severe asthma, etc., who stayed at home and had minimal contact with anybody to avoid infection. Asymptomatic transmission would be where a person who's not unwell currently unknowingly gives the disease, spreads on the virus to somebody else.
Yeah. And okay, thank you. And that's very good. And one thing that I was just going to do is I'm going to forward you an article about asymptomatic transmission that I came into contact with, because my understanding of that is there's a difference of opinion in scientific thought as well in terms of how big a problem asymptomatic transmission is. And that, so in terms of medical colleagues, I'm just sending it because I think it's interesting.
Okay, good.
Anybody else who wants to see it can. But anyway, fine, thank you. So are you, 3C, are you more likely to listen to a friend, expert or celebrity when it comes to adopting behavioural modifications relating to keeping you and your family safe in regards to this?
An expert.
An expert, okay. When stories arose about people breaking the rules, do you think that helped, hindered, or had no effect on the public health response or the public's response to this?
I think when Dominic Cummings broke the government rules, that absolutely had the effect of breaking public trust in the government.
Yeah.
Up until that point, the Prime Minister had said a very simple message: please stay at home.
Yeah.
And at that point, when Dominic Cummings was allowed to travel from one end of the country to another and then go out on an hour's drive to test his eyesight, the public perceived that there was one rule for the government elite and there was another rule for everybody else.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. And then the final question, 3E, and then we end with a have I got news for you style picture round. But are there any phrases or words that spring to mind about 2020 and the COVID-19 pandemic as a whole?
Anxiety. And I would say that because of the effect it's had on lots of my patients, those who had underlying mental health problems, they've either got worse or they've reoccurred.
Hmm.
I think a lot of people have been scared about their income, about the health of their families, particularly their elderly relatives.
Hmm.
So I think the mental health effects of COVID and the lockdown has almost been as big as the effect of the virus on individuals who are infected.
Okay, thank you. And when you say the effect of the lockdown has almost been as big on and the way that the virus affects people, can you understand why? I mean, you might not see it so much because you, right at the beginning of this interview, said that you don't really use social and new forms of media. But if I were to tell you that it's almost like Brexit all over again in terms of people are split, certainly on social media, there's 50% that get it, understand it, tell people, and 50% of people that are kind of COVID deniers, would that surprise you?
No, it wouldn't surprise me.
Okay. Thank you. So the last thing is I'm just going to share my screen, and the thing that I'm going to do is, hold on, this will come up and share. Here we go. So if I go to move, why can't I do it? Oh no, hold on, I need to go. Sorry, I need to get it back.
It's okay, Kish. It's very good.
Thanks. I just need to open it up again because that was right at the beginning. Sorry, that was right at the end. So here we go. I've got that one, and then this should just run through like a slideshow. So I'm just going to share that. So these are faces and phrases of the pandemic, and I'm just going to share my screen again so you can see it. And my question to you is, who is it and what's their job?
Okay, so that's Dr. Is it Van Tam?
Yep.
He's one of the senior medical advisors.
Yep, Deputy Chief Medical Officer. Thank you very much. It's really small, so sorry about that. I'll make it a bit bigger.
Yeah, again, I don't know her name, but I think she is, is she Deputy Scientific Officer?
She's another Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Jenny Harries.
Jenny, yeah, okay. She is a public health expert, professor, I think, at a university.
She is. Her name. Devi Sridhar, Public Health, Chair of Global Public Health at the University of Edinburgh, and also a SAGE advisor for Scotland.
Yeah. Forgotten his name, but he was the leader of the World Health Authority, World Health Organization.
Dr. Tedros, the Director General of the World Health Organization. Yep.
Don't know. Don't recognize her.
Dr. Maria Van Kerkhove, the World Health Organization Technical Lead for COVID-19.
No, don't recognize.
June Rain, the chair of MHRA, who's approved the vaccines and things. This is actually taken from that press release that went out on social media. Mm. And then the last person.
Yeah, Donna Cummings.
Okay.
Former chief advisor to the Prime Minister.
Yeah. And then finally, when we got locked down in March, this was the slogan and the government messaging. Do you remember what these words were that have been pixelated?
I know one of them is stay home.
Yeah, stay home.
Another one is protect the NHS.
Yep.
There's another one, stay safe.
Save lives for the last one, but you've done the best for anybody else so far, so that's good for this one. And then this is the current messaging in that format, which is green and yellow, and this is when they changed after the lockdown 1. Can you remember what these words are?
Is it hands, space, don't know, because I forgot.
Okay, no. So yeah, the current messaging is also hands, space, and test. But this is stay alert, control the virus, save lives.
Now, I definitely wouldn't know that one at the moment because I think people have reached a kind of message fatigue. And yes, that's interesting. I didn't know that one. That's okay.
Brilliant. So thank you very much. That's bang on 30 minutes for the interview.
Okay. Okay.
Have you got any other thoughts, comments, questions that you'd like to ask?
Not within the interview.
Okay.
I'll just say something else to you afterwards about
Yeah,
my
of course. So I'm
friend.
just going to